Hi everyone. We're doing a special crossover with Jerry's Take on China, and I'm Jason from the Bridge Podcast, and we're going to be talking today a little bit about Chinese development finance and the BRI. Hello, Jerry. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. I've noticed that it's pretty cold in Beijing.
It's,
Yesterday in Zhongshan, and from the map, we can see we're 2,000 kilometers south of you. It's 29 yesterday, 29 C, and today is only 27.
oh my gosh, it's so
So
cold
hence,
there.
hence the T-shirt.
It's snowing here. Today was the first big snow.
Okay,
They have the
nice.
Chinese the calendar where they tell you each time the
Yeah,
weather's going to
yeah,
change, and there was I think it was Saturday, like 2 days ago, was the big snow or
yeah.
and that's
Be
what
cold.
it is on the calendar.
Yeah.
And today in Beijing, the first big snow. So that's kind of
It's
neat.
like an almanac, actually. It's a really good thing. People should, there's 24 terms that they use to divide the
That's right.
year into
Yeah.
24 different parts. We should do a show about that. Just
Yeah,
that
that
on
would be
its own
fun.
would
That'd
be
be a
an
lot of fun.
interesting show.
In Beijing, it seems to come true because they had the first small snow or
Mhm.
something like that 2 weeks ago, and then
Yeah.
suddenly the temperature just dropped on that day, like 15 degrees to like zero. It was really cold that day. I was just surprised how accurate it was. It's
They've had plenty of time to get it right.
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So today we'll be talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. So what
Yeah.
is the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, I'd like to go a little bit because I've been reading about this and about Chinese development finance. Before they actually launched the Belt and Road Initiative, China was already engaged in like what they call Chinese development finance, where
Mm.
different banks, China Import and Export Bank, sometimes called China Exim Bank, was making loans, and so were independent banks making loans for development projects all over the world. In fact, as early as the African independence movies in the independent movements in the 1960s, when countries were getting their
Colonial
independent
independence.
status, yeah, from the
Mm.
Europeans, basically, China was already coming over and building small scale
Mm.
hydropower projects and
And
stuff.
this was well before China opened and reformed.
Right. Yes. And
Mm.
so there's been an ongoing, what they call in the UN, it's called South South development. The global South being all the countries that have yet to develop. And
Mm.
China has been a big part of doing that forever.
Mm.
From 2000 to 2010 or so, way before Belt and Road, China was already doing this kind of around the world, schools, hospitals, and so forth. And so the Belt and Road Initiative kind of took that and reformatted it in a new way, which is
Mm.
based on logistics and market growth between countries so that the South could kind of rise together.
Yeah. I've got an interesting point that I came up with a few weeks ago. I was writing an article, and it just hit me. These things hit me in momentarily instance lapses of reason, and I wrote it down. So my main point about what China is doing in the underdeveloped world
Mhm, mhm,
is that if the colonial era had been at all interested in the places they were colonizing, there wouldn't be a developing world. They would have
mhm,
developed it already. They had 400 years of plundering,
mhm.
exploiting Africa, South Central America, Asia, and they didn't develop it. The only places they developed, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, they developed the places that they wanted to settle in, but they didn't develop India. They didn't develop Africa. All they did was take resources from those. So the reason we have an underdeveloped or global South is because the global North has exploited it for 400 years. Had
Yeah.
they not done that, had they done what China is doing now, we may have a very different world.
There are so many different points I want to make about that. I wish maybe we
Yeah,
could do two shows about this. But I have a British friend. He always said, "Oh well, we built the rail in India, in South Asia,"
they did.
and well, a lot of
Look
that
at
was
it.
just so they could get India's wealth to ports. So the purpose of those
Well, in all
yeah.
fairness, that's what China is doing too. I mean, let's not be rosy glassed about this. China is doing the same thing. There is method in their madness. However, what they're doing there is they're leaving infrastructure, and they're doing it in a controlled manner. Now, they don't just build a train line. They build, as they've done in Laos, for example, and Andy Borum did a great video on this. In Laos, they didn't just build a train line, they built a train training school so that the Laotians can actually take over the running of it. They now have, currently, they have a Chinese general manager or CEO of the train system, but they've actually got trained Laotians coming through the ranks, and in time this will be all part of it. Now they don't just say we're going to build this to Laos, we're going to build this from Laos through to Malaysia, and we're going to go to Malaysia, and then we're going to go through Thailand into Malaysia and all the way down to Singapore. So ultimately, this train line that goes from Kunming right now may very well go to Indonesia as well. And
Mhm.
then there's no reason why, given China's development, and they did talk about this a few years ago, we could end up on a train all the way to Australia.
Yeah, I've heard
Amazing
about that
thought.
too. I heard about the one to Indonesia. I haven't heard about the
Mm,
one to Australia. That sounds kind of literally a bit of a stretch. But there's actually a difference. There's another difference we need to point out between the infrastructure projects that are being developed in these places and the ones that were developed under European colonialism. When the European imperialists were in the underdeveloped world, which
mhm,
they were underdeveloping, they were literally extracting wealth.
yeah.
They were governing those places, and they were making the decisions to extract that wealth. Now, under the Belt and Road Initiative, it's the nations in themselves that are coming to China and saying, we want a railroad. We have this
Mm,
mine. We want to get this product to market. Will help you be one of the benefactors of that. So China
mm,
is making
mm,
loans oftentimes under the Belt and Road Initiative and helping develop the infrastructure so that they can get their product to market, and also buying that product in some cases. But the deciding factors, the decision makers in what infrastructure gets built, is coming from the developing countries themselves. So
mm.
it's not like China is just like going into Kenya and building rail and then taking coal out like the Europeans did. So I do
Mm.
want to differentiate that.
Yeah, a great example of that was the Solomon Islands, where China signed an agreement which absolutely upset the Australians. It upset the Americans because the Solomon Islands is their backyard. But
Mm.
the Solomon Islands prime minister stood up in the United Nations and said, "I am a democratically elected prime minister. I took the decision to my democratically elected parliament, and we made a decision that we were going to align ourselves with the Chinese for this particular purpose." It doesn't mean we hate the Australians. It doesn't mean we hate America, but it means that we are now aligning ourselves with an with a Chinese strategy democratically. Please stop
Mhm.
criticizing us for doing this. This is what you wanted us to do. Be democratic. We are being democratic, and this is how it worked. Now, I'm sure quite a lot of African countries are doing the same thing. They're making this decision because it's the best decision for the people rather than
Mhm.
the best decision for China.
Mhm. Well, you mean China is absolutely, like you mentioned, not the rose-colored glasses. China benefits
Mm,
from this too, and
of course,
you clearly know the term I'm about to throw out: win-win diplomacy.
well,
China is helping build these infrastructure projects. Oftentimes, not always, oftentimes it's Chinese companies that get the contracts to build these projects.
mhm,
So, like China Exim Bank or ICBC will make a huge loan. Which I have to mention, I do look at these loans all the time, every day for an hour or two a day. Most of them are like 2% loans. Some of them are 0%
mm,
loans.
mhm.
Very rarely are they a little higher, but they're not even close to the open market loans that come from like Paris Group and things like that. So China, and then they make a minimum in a US Treasury. And at the same time, then Chinese companies get the ability to develop that infrastructure. But what the recipient country, who usually initiates the idea of building that project, gets is the
Mm.
infrastructure that they want at a low interest. And they usually get a lot of support with that as well, because like you said, China will often provide training to local officials, the linkages from that infrastructure to other parts of the Belt and Road or other parts of that developing economy.
Yeah, there's also some sidelines on this as well. So maybe the China will build a rail line, maybe China will build a hospital, maybe they'll do, but they're actually building something else as well. They're building community in there. You're right. They go in there with a Chinese company on a Chinese loan, building a Chinese designed school, hospital, or whatever it is. But the people who are doing the work, the guys with the shovels and the picks, they are local people getting local salaries. So that helps the local economy. Then when they finish building a school, what happens? Kids go to that school.
Yeah.
Now you're building an educational system which they didn't
Mhm.
have in the past, and they've done this in Iraq just recently. They've
Mhm.
built 10,000 schools in Iraq.
I think they've only finished 2,000, but
Yeah,
8,000 are
they're
on their way.
building 10,000. Sorry, so you had 10,000 schools in Iraq. Now, why the hell didn't America do that?
They said they
America,
were going to in
yeah,
2002 to
America said they were going to
2007. They're like,
rebuild
oh,
it.
we're gonna build it all amazing. It's
Yeah,
gonna be great, but way better than it was before. And then no.
but the Iraqi government have asked Americans to leave, and Americans won't leave. They say we can't leave. It's not safe for us to leave. But
Well, they have this
where's democracy?
yeah, exactly. The United States actually made a military strike about a week ago in Iraq. So that's, even US imperialism there hasn't ended. But I
No.
want to differentiate a few things because
Good.
I do post every day on Twitter and Reddit and elsewhere, like posts about things that China has developed or is developing. Not all
Mm.
of them are actually the Belt and Road. And it's very confusing, and it's still confusing to me. I was at a think tank group recently there was the Belt and Road Forum going on in Beijing, and I got to go to a Belt and Road sidebar with Eric Solheim, former Undersecretary of the United Nations,
Mm.
and the foreign ambassador for Cambodia. And while I was there, I asked the president of a group called GGI, which is the Global Governance Institute, Kevin, who is a Chinese gentleman, what qualifies as Belt and Road. And I brought up an example of a hospital that was built in Cambodia for free by China, by the Chinese military, actually, as a gift from China to Cambodia. So I
Yeah.
asked Kevin, because he's a former military gentleman, about this hospital. Is this the Belt and Road? Is what I was asking him, because we're at a Belt
Mm.
and Road side forum with a bunch of think tanks. He's the president of a think tank. He's Chinese. And I'm asking him, is this Belt and Road? And he said, kind of. He said that the concept of the Belt and Road umbrella doesn't always define exactly what is part of the Belt and Road and what
Right.
is not. So I've taken to kind of differentiating things myself into categories. There's Chinese emergency aid, and it's oftentimes called that. And China does a lot of this. This is similar to what America does.
A
The United
great
States,
example was Afghanistan just a few months ago when they had an earthquake. They sent, I think, $30 million US dollars
right?
straight into Afghanistan. That's
Also, just
emergency
food,
aid.
trucks loaded with rice and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they've done that multiple times with Afghanistan, also, and the Philippines a couple of times because there've been massive hurricanes, and Tonga when the volcano went off, all over the place. Nepal right after the earthquake in 2016, and recently again in Nepal. So China's constantly giving this emergency aid, and oftentimes that's food, that's tents, that's sleeping bags, that's water cleaning devices,
And
lanterns,
doctors,
that kind of stuff.
doctors
So
and nurses.
go ahead.
They,
Sorry.
they sent doctors and nurses too.
Yeah.
Mm.
So China does this all the time, especially in emergencies. But
Mm.
this is not China's MO for helping develop economies. So the United States does this as its aid, oftentimes.
US aid. Yeah.
Yeah, USAID has a lot, and it also donates through the United Nations. That's oftentimes just food aid. And a lot of the other aid from the United States, honestly, is military aid, or it's money to buy US military weapons. So
Mm.
people oftentimes point to the United States, well, look at all the aid they have. But if you actually look at the categories of aid, an enormous amount of that is just going to support the US military industrial complex. But the United States does, in all fairness, supply a lot of food to the developing world, or the underdeveloped world, as you rightly pointed out earlier. However, China doesn't really think like that, except in emergencies. China is actually trying to create self-sufficiency. So they have something called Chinese Development Finance, or Chinese Development Aid. And this is separate from the actual Belt and Road, which is mostly loans to build projects. These are free infrastructure projects, which is kind of what I've been posting. I'm not posting on my Twitter a lot of the actual projects that cost 2%, that are like $10 billion projects to build a hydropower dam that's going to provide electricity for the entire country. I'm actually talking about Chinese development aid. And so these projects are generally grants. And so grants, and I get a lot of flack for this, are free. People say, don't use the word free, Jason. Everything costs something. So they mean diplomacy, I guess. So
soft power.
To me, if you're going to do diplomacy, a free hospital's dang good way to do diplomacy.
Better than building a military base.
Right.
I think,
So
unless they need a military base. Actually, China did this in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan needed a military base to stop towards the end of the Afghan war. There was a problem with Afghan refugees getting into Kazakhstan. So they built a military complex, small, but they call it a police station, but it's not. It's a military police station, an
I didn't
armed
know that.
police station. Yeah, it was an interesting thing because, of course, what happens if they get into Kazakhstan? They could also sneak across back into Xinjiang through Kazakhstan. So the Chinese government were keen to prevent that happening. So they built. So sometimes it's necessary to build military installations, and that was one. Djibouti is another example where the Horn of Africa, the pirates. So they built a naval base and a military installation there, which is necessary to prevent the piracy through across the Horn of Africa through Ethiopia, Eritrea.
I think it's really interesting to point out for that specific one, because I think it's the only real foreign military base that China has
It is.
anywhere in the
It's the
world,
only one. Yeah,
is that America asked China to build that.
correct. And
Yeah, America,
before
you need to
in
do your part, China. You need to help
yeah,
with piracy.
in the past, yeah, because it's all your stuff coming through here, which is true.
Right.
So in the past, they used to report positively about. You can still find in the archives, in the military U.S. military stars and stripes and things like that, very positive reports about how China's contribution was so helpful to the piracy problem in the Horn of Africa. Now they've got piracy problems elsewhere. It may happen again somewhere else, but yeah, that military aid is an interesting one. Military aid is very different to military occupation like Okinawa or South Korea or the places that Guam. 30% of the island of the territory of Guam is an American military base. 30% of the country
Wow.
is an American military base. That's a different situation.
Well, I think, you're pointing out interesting examples of these smaller places. We think of Okinawa, right?
Mm.
But actually, I've heard a lot of people argue that, Japan is basically a colonized place for the United States. South Korea is also either protest. For the
Yeah.
last at least 20 years that I've been paying attention, there are protests pretty much every year in South Korea asking the United States to leave. But,
Daily in Okinawa, because in Okinawa, the local people, the Ryushi people, don't believe they are Japanese. They have
right.
been occupied by the Japanese, which are then in turn occupied by the Americans with the Japanese compliance. So there's an extra problem for them, an extra layer of protest that they need to go through. So they have a permanent protest point outside of some of the military bases. Permanent. It's there every day.
Well,
Mm.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the actual projects, and I was scared thinking about how we're going to do this, Jerry, because
No,
I don't
it's
want to
too
just
much.
turn into a giant list of stuff. So I think we should talk about each one kind of slowly a little bit.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's going to just sound like too much information. So these are examples I put out
I like what
for.
you've done. You sent me a note. Can I, for this note that you sent me, I'm
Mhm.
looking at two screens here. The note that you sent me, when we post this, I'm going to put this, I'm going to put this on Substack and I'm going to link it to this video so that people can watch the video and have a look at this and say, wow, this is where we are with this. If you don't mind, I mean, I've made a few of my own notes on it, but without any editing, I'm just going to put notes from our discussion because it divides it into hospitals, into roads, into other things. And I think it's really important how you structured this, that we can follow that for our discussion today, if that's okay.
Well, I just want to mention a couple of things about this.
Mm.
Each one of these projects, before I posted it, I checked like 20 different websites and 20 different articles. I provide usually 3 or 4 different links. Sometimes it's just one, but
Mm.
that was just because I was working on aesthetics to get people interested in this so that people would be aware of what China was doing. But these are proven links. Most of them are come from university websites. So I go to
Mhm.
this website, the College of William and Mary, which is a highly reputable university in in the United States, and they have a whole suite of information about China's Belt and Road Initiative. I also go to Kerry's website, which is part of Johns Hopkins University, for every one of these projects, and
Mm.
I check all of these academic references. So these are verified projects that China has paid for, usually in total. Each one of them will mention. So for one
Mm.
example, so we can get out of the abstract, is China donated a hospital to Kenya.
Mhm.
It's a $11 million 5-story facility with outpatient services, ER, 12 ICU beds, 84 beds, a lab, maternity unit, operating theater, and equipment. So I
Donated.
mean, yeah. So this is creating the conditions for independence. So the United States and China and Europeans, they all send doctors. There's Doctors Without Borders.
Mm,
There's private wealthy individuals in these countries that send doctors with their own money. They have their own NGOs. People
mm,
donate lots of money just to different campaigns. But if you can build an underdeveloped place a hospital and provide even medical training in some cases for nurses and doctors who go
mhm.
to universities in China on scholarships, and then they have their own hospital, you create the conditions where they don't need aid.
I met a
You know,
man in Guangzhou 6 months ago, back in June. I met this guy, and he was an African, and we started chatting to each other. And I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm in medical supplies." Oh, that's interesting. He said, "Yeah, I export everything to Africa." And I said, "Well, how'd you get into that?" He said, "I came to China to train as a doctor. I trained as a doctor, worked as a doctor in Guangdong for several years, and then I gave that up and started exporting medical stuff back to the people I trained with back in, I think it was Uganda that where he came from. So he came from Uganda on a scholarship to China, and now for the last 26 years has lived in China. He is totally
mm,
fluent in he speaks Cantonese as well, but totally fluent in Putonghua. We had a great conversation, and it was just amazing that he stopped practicing as a doctor 3 or 4 years after he graduated, but he never practiced in Africa. He stayed in China. All of his classmates went back to Africa, but now he has a business where he kind of services their needs. So there's a great example. 25, 26 years ago, this happened. It's a pretty good system.
well, I mean, I think the point I really want to make is that if you're a nation, do you want to have your own hospital where you have your own physicians and your own doctors and you can take care of your own people? Or do you want to be
Yes.
dependent on an NGO or the United States or Canada or
Red Cross
China?
coming in.
Right.
Mm,
I think most people, they want to know that they are part of the global economy. People want to have self-respect. So what China is doing is essentially giving people independence. So they have
yeah.
political independence, and China is essentially helping them have greater degrees of economic independence because they're able to provide for their own people. They
Yeah.
have hospitals for their own people with their own physicians in those hospitals with maybe a little bit of support from the
They
outside
get
world.
support, yeah.
Yeah.
There's another interesting aspect to that that most people don't consider is the cultural aspect. If you are in Kenya and you are Kenyan and you are seen by a Swiss or French or an Italian doctor, that doctor doesn't have the same cultural awareness of your needs. Now, if you're in Kenya, you're not necessarily a Muslim and have different needs, but you'd have your own tribal needs, whereas the Kenyan doctor would know that and would understand that. And it's the
Mm.
same. We come to China. You've probably been to a hospital. It's very different, isn't it, to a Western hospital? Privacy is a little less obvious. You'll be in the doctor's room, and someone will walk in to see what's going on with the foreigner. You might be having a medical examination, and someone wants to know, and then there's three people standing at the door looking in to see what's going on. Now, that's a cultural thing. It's very different, but Africa would have the same kind of things, whereas China says, "Well, we're going to build your hospital. We're going to help you to staff it. We're going to give you some Chinese staff." And there are Chinese staff all over Africa doing eye surgeries and heart surgeries,
Mhm.
and they spend time over there, and it's part of their personal growth and professional growth as well. They go to a third world
Mhm.
country and do many more operations than they would do in their own country. But ultimately, they're training the locals to do the job that they do. That's the purpose. So
Mhm.
that cultural awareness becomes less of an issue.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really
Mm.
good point. So, just really quickly, I'm going to go through a couple of the
Yep, you've got some good ones here. I've lost you.
13 $31 million to build a center for children with disabilities in Mongolia.
Mm.
That's a beautiful hospital, by the way. And I saw lots of pictures of it. It looks amazing. And there's
But
China spent $30 million for a hospital in Laos. And these are just some examples. I can't go through all of them because there's probably 100 hospitals that China has
mm,
built for free as gifts. In some cases, the same country, two or three. So they're all over the global south. They're in South America, they're in Africa, they're in Central Asia, they're in Southeast Asia, they're everywhere. And a
mm,
lot of island countries in the Pacific as well, which I imagine Australia doesn't like, which is disturbing, actually.
Here's the thing, if Samoa needs a hospital and Australia says we can't afford to build you one and China says we can, what's wrong with China helping out there? Now, this is Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, all of these countries have been supplying Australia with Australian needs in terms of some exports and I was going to say slave labor or forced labor, but cheap labor is probably a better way to describe it. I mean, anyone who wants to research this can research the history of the Kanakas. That's Kanakas with K's, K-A-N-A-K, Kanakas. And the Kanakas were the islanders who were brought across at very minimal wages to cut the cane, pick the vegetables. Basically, they were brought across as indentured labor, and they were given a season, paid whatever they were paid and sent back. Now that's been going on for well over 100 years, and it still goes on today. And Australian farmers will say, we need them. We need this cheap labor. Otherwise, the price of your carrots is going up. And this is when you get to a point where you say the price of your food will go up unless we can have forced labor to pick them, then you have something wrong with your society. If that's the way your society must run, there's a big problem there. And that's what Australia's been doing with the islands. And now China has come along and saying, we want to help you. We want to build you this hospital, build this port, build these roads, build these schools. And whilst they're doing that, Australia is saying, hang on a second, this is our backyard. We've been supporting them for 100 years. Well, yeah, why do they still need a hospital? Why do they still need a port? Why do they still need roads? Why are you still exploiting their workers? That's what needs to be asked in this world. If you were supporting them, why do they need China now?
That is a very good point.
If you'd supported them properly,
I wrote a book about this, and it's not out yet. It's going to be published in the next couple of months, about the difference between, I call it Euro-American imperialism, and what the China's Belt and Road Initiative, and how the two things are fundamentally different in what China is trying to accomplish. And basically, the point that you just made is the thesis of the book. So, yeah, China's coming along and giving these economies the ability to develop themselves. And Europe and the United States are, oh my gosh, how dare China be involved in these countries? Everyone watch out for this debt trap. Yeah. But the reality is China is giving these countries more autonomy. When you build a hydropower dam, you don't need oil imports as much, right? You don't need coal imports as much. You have a century, right?
Did you know? Have you met Mubarak Mugabe?
I know who he is.
Yeah, he lived in Beijing for quite a while. He's back in Uganda. I interviewed him during the Belt and Road Summit. He was here as a journalist for Ugandan TV. And he's got a great story about the hydro dam. He made it into a personal story. He wrote an article about a couple from different parts of Uganda who met at the hydro dam, and now they have a family. It's, China brought them together, kind of thing. It was a great story, a human interest story, but it told the story of the dam. Uganda has forever, ever since they've had electricity, been subject to brownouts and blackouts, problems. Now they have steady electricity flow, and they are able to export electricity to neighboring countries because of one dam. One dam has changed Uganda's electrical environment, or electrical generation environment, completely. And it's created a love story while it was doing it, which was a nice way to do it. But there's a great example that Uganda was a British colony for many, many years. Why did they still have those problems?
Well, there's so many things I want to cover that my brain is going crazy.
One
is you decrease the reliance on imports for energy, but another thing is, in addition to that, the electrification of these countries that were formerly not fully electrified allows things like the development of modern infrastructure, like factories.
Yes.
So China doesn't have a huge role nationally at building a lot of factories. Actually, it does. A few dozen, but not as much as most private companies are doing. And even a lot of European companies are coming in and now developing these. But this is fundamentally changing the developed world, because during the modernization of Europe, America, Australia, all these underdeveloped places were being underdeveloped so that they could provide raw materials that were then exported via these railways and such to Europe Australia, United States, where they had manufacturing, and then those finished goods were sold back to the Africans in Southeast
All of
Asian,
them.
South Asian
Yeah.
at huge inflated rates. So basically, Europe, the United States, Australia, basically the G7 to some extent, were manufacturing everything and controlling the global economy. And
Mm.
China is shaking that up. Now manufacturing is going into these places, these underdeveloped places, and
Yeah.
making them developed, and they can use their own resources to process their own materials and deliver to their own populations and the global community new kinds of finished products,
That's
basically raising them
I've
out
got
of
an
poverty.
interesting add-on to that, actually. I live in a city called Zhongshan. When I came to Zhongshan nearly 20 years ago, it was a huge shoe, boot, jeans, and t-shirt manufacturer. That's what was going on in Zhongshan. It's now a high-tech zone. It's very high-tech. It does have some manufacturing, for example, a lot of CNC machining going on, but it's CNC machining for the high-tech world. And Huawei are just about to open up. They announced a couple of days ago they're going to open a new factory or new building, new site in Zhongshan. So that's the kind of way ours has gone. Now, where are all the t-shirts and the manufacturing? Most of the t-shirts have moved to places like Indonesia, Thailand, Bangladesh. The shoes are in Cambodia and Vietnam. And all of these, and I actually know business owners who have set up their own businesses in those countries. I'm a personal friend of a guy who has a factory in Cambodia who used to have a factory here. And he comes back here from time to time and I see him. But he's Cambodia. It wasn't the perfect solution for him, but it's getting there. He's settled down now, all of the problems that he had for the first 2 or 3 years. So what's happened is that low tech, high volume, but low profit has all moved offshore or moved out of the Greater Bay Area, which is where I am. I'm about 70, 80 minutes from Hong Kong by ferry, or an hour by road on the new bridge now. So we've moved from being a low cost manufacturing area into a very high technology, high profit, high driven area. It's a technology driven area. So that's an add on to what you were just saying. Those places now have the infrastructure to build those factories. They didn't have the power, they didn't have the roads, they didn't have the ports to ship the things. So now with China's aid, they start, and Cambodia is a great example of this. They've got schools, they've got hospitals, they've got roads, they've got a new port, they've got all of the things that China has, but on a smaller scale, and can now offer those services to the rest of the world, which they couldn't do before. All they had before was tourism. And some of their tourism is pretty horrible. I've been to I mean, when I say horrible, I mean horrifically horrible. They have the Killing Fields museums and things like that. But then, of course, they got Angkor Wat and other fantastic things too. So yeah, they were basically living on tourism until China started to move its low cost, low technology out to places like that. So there's a
Hmm.
benefit for them. Many
Well,
don't.
I also want to talk about energy again because I want to
Mm,
talk about Laos since you're talking about Cambodia. So
yeah.
in Laos, the year 2000, they only had about 20% electrification throughout the entire country. And by
Oh.
2019, they had 100% electrification. And most of that is down to a series of about 10 dams. And these are not, as far as I know, gifts. They were not donated. They were like very low interest, 0, 1% loans that cost billions of dollars, but they went from zero electrification to 100% electrification during that same 20 years. And I cannot say that these are causally related, but they're correlated perhaps. Uh, Life expectancy went up by about 10 years over the same period of time. So
Mm,
China is providing the kind of infrastructure that we take for granted, modern life. They're literally coming into modernity. And part of modernity is, like you mentioned before, schools and
mm,
education, but it's also basic things like electrification and roads and factories.
mm. Yeah, I've not been to Laos, but I have been several times to Cambodia, and I saw it. First time I saw it was more than 10 years ago. Pretty underdeveloped in the areas, even around Siem Reap, which is a hugely tourist. You've got your tourist resorts, of course, but then you've got the town center, and they're very, very different. So even in places like that, they have now developed. They have grossly developed. I mean, it's incredible the changes. If you go back to Cambodia now, and I have actually, 2019, I was back in Siem Reap again, because I had a family member visiting there and said, "Oh, well, you're very close to here. Why don't we meet up there?" So I did, but it was my third visit to the same place, which is something I probably wouldn't normally do. But it was interesting to see how that changed, how the places have developed, mostly in Siem Reap, mostly through tourism, and much of that, a huge amount of that, is Chinese tourism. They all
Mm.
take WeChat. Many of them speak Chinese. They they speak English too, but it really is it's a changing world that we're living in.
Well, I wanted to also mention, a lot. I
Mm,
think a lot of people who don't know much about the Belt and Road Initiative think that it has a lot to do, or almost exclusively to do, with ports and roads and bridges. So
mm,
I wanted to say, yes, China does build roads and bridges and things. A lot of those are actually donated. So in Bangladesh, they're on their eighth Friendship Bridge. Now, I was actually only able to find four of them. I'm not sure where the other ones are, but I found Friendship Bridge number 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I was able to find pictures of them and information. They were all gifts from China. I still
right.
haven't been able to find 1 through 4, but I wanted to point out, this is in the Maldives. I hope I'm
Mm.
pronouncing that correctly. A
Yeah,
26,
Maldives. Yeah,
yeah,
I think is French pronunciation, Maldives.
It's a
Yeah.
$26.59 million road, which was built for free. Now, I looked at the map of this from above. It's not included in the pictures, and it
Mm.
basically is the entire landmass of the
Yes,
Maldives.
it's not a very large place.
Yeah, so they basically built the main road system for the entire island country. So that's amazing. And I have before and after pictures, which Jerry's going to use, so you guys can see that for yourself.
It'll be on the link. Yeah, and that yeah, that is amazing, because what does the Maldives, or Maldives, depending on how you want to say it, Maldivas, it's got all kinds of different names, but what does that have to offer China? This is a really interesting question, because it's
Tours,
not big enough to have it's tourism and fishing rights.
fishing
So
rights.
yeah, China's got some fishing rights around
China
that
goes
region.
that far into
Yeah.
to
Oh,
go fishing right
China
over
goes
there.
to Patagonia for fishing. I mean,
Wow.
there's not many places China doesn't go for its fishing. We like fish here.
Yeah,
Well, some
sure,
of us do.
absolutely.
I'm looking at the wife now. She likes fish. Yeah, so they've got fishing rights in that area. Now, you could argue that that's unfair. Well, hang on a second. How much fish do the Maldives need? Yeah, they don't need all that much fish on their islands, and they have a lot surrounding them. So, and the other thing, of course, now China's exploiting the fish. No, they're not. They have fishing moratoriums. They have periods of time when they're not allowed to fish. They have certain things they're not allowed to catch. Yeah, there are rules, and they're abiding by those rules. They're doing that everywhere in the world. China has fishing moratoriums now. That's another aspect of this for another day.
Well, just like there is in the West, where we have a cultural movements to control our own habits sometimes, the same thing happened here in China while we were here,
Mm.
in that, and maybe around 2012, 2013, there was suddenly a movement to stop eating shark. So Chinese media went into a
Shark's fin,
frenzy.
not shark,
The
but
shark
shark's
fin.
fin.
Yeah, but they
Mm,
so they stopped basically fishing for that because
mm,
big celebrities came out and said, "We don't eat this. This is wrong. Stop doing this." And so this stopped happening as a
mm.
cultural phenomenon. Not completely, but 99% of it is gone. So just like
There
in
was
the
a good
West.
reason for
Mhm.
that, Jason, and that was that they weren't catching the shark. They were catching the shark, cutting its top fin off, and throwing it back so it would just die. It needs that fin
Mm.
in order to swim. It needs to swim in order to breathe. So, in other words, it's just going to die a slow death in the water. It's drowning, and that was the reason. It's the cruelty of it. If they were catching the whole shark and utilizing the entire shark, the shark's meat, and in the UK we eat shark's meat, and Australia too. It's called flake in Australia. I'm not sure what they call it in the UK, but they call it flake in Australia, and that's shark meat. So we do catch sharks, but they don't catch the shark and say, let's just cruelly cut off this fin and throw the shark back to die in pain, a slow drowning death. We catch the shark and we utilize it in the same way that we would if we're killing a cow or a sheep. So there's not much difference in that. But yeah, that was just because of the cruelty around the way Chinese people, Chinese fishermen, were doing it, and it was cruel. There's no question about that. Same as the dog meat thing. It needed to stop. The cruelty. People who say I can eat a cow, why can't I eat a dog? Fair, no problem. I don't have an argument to bring that to the table. If you're not a vegan and you eat meat, then you shouldn't have a problem eating dog. But what you do have a problem with, or shark, what you do have a problem with is the cruelty involved in bringing that meat to your table. And that's what had to stop. That's the social movement that you saw.
Well, I mean, my
Yeah,
point is more about conservation. Like Chinese
yeah.
folks are aware of the limits of our ecosystem, just like other people in other countries.
Mm.
More of these examples real quick, just a couple. So we're into schools now, and I talked to Jeffrey Sachs about this, and he was talking about there are 6 steps to creating the world to spend. Probably going to happen in terms of what kind of money is available from various countries, but it's a beautiful ideal. But one of the things he mentions that people need is education. So one of the things that China has been providing is friendship schools. So there are several examples where China spends sometimes just a few $100,000. Some of the schools I found were as cheap as $400,000, and some of them, most of them, are between 11 and 20 million dollars to build schools around the world. So there, I have an example here from Kenya, one from Ethiopia, one from Eritrea, and a couple of others in Cameroon and
Namibia.
elsewhere. But they're also, I mean, the ones I put in here in the example, they're, I think we have a rock here, which it says
Yeah,
1,000 are
in
finished.
your
It's
example.
going to be 10,000 eventually. But China's actually building like 2 or 3 schools in about 100 countries. And almost all of those are completely free. Not only does China build the school, China usually furbishes the school, gives them like backpacks for students and books and libraries and like tables and everything that they would need to open the school in what we call, or what's known as, a turnkey donation. So
Yeah.
they literally, you can open the school now, go. And so like
Yeah.
these places that didn't have school, or had a very old school that was built, a century ago, suddenly they have the ability to educate a whole new generation of people, which again gives them more autonomy and more
Yep.
independence.
And some of these schools also have sports fields and things
Mhm.
like that, which again, that adds to your life expectancy. It improves your lifestyle when you've got kids taking part in sport instead of going and sitting in a dank classroom. And in all honesty, 20 years ago in China, I've seen these type of schools here in China, traveling through Guangxi. I've got some great photographs from years ago when my wife and I went on a charity tour. We donated some money to charity and we were invited to go on this bus trip to Guangxi province. The places we saw, the places I've seen, oh my God. And you think, how can China do what it's doing now? But I've been
You
back
should
to
do
Guangxi.
before and after photo book.
Um, I've tried to do that. I mean, I traveled through Ningxia in 2014, and then I traveled through again in 2019, and just that 5.5 year difference, incredible difference, incredible. You've gone from abject poverty in Ningxia, still inside of China, west of Beijing. It's kind of literally about this point of your head on the map behind you, where the pink bit is Gansu. Ningxia is, yeah, yeah. Yeah, Ningxia is a wonderful place to visit, and it's just full of Islamic culture. It's a Muslim culture. It's wine culture. And it was full of poverty until a few years ago, and now it's not. There's still some poor people there, of course there are, but the poverty is gone. The people lived in mud huts and caves, and now in proper houses. This is the ghost towns that they build. They build these ghost towns, and then all of a
Ordos.
sudden you see tens of thousands of people moved from hovels into modern apartments like that. So this is one of the reasons why we have ghost towns, but that's another story for another day too.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point. I wanted to talk about this, but I had forgotten until you said some of the things you just mentioned. China can do that United States cannot do. The United States obviously still has manufacturing going. One thing that it doesn't have is the modernization process that it once went through decades and decades ago. And this was pointed out to me by Jeffrey Sachs, is that China has all of this infrastructure for construction, for all the schools and hospitals that it built here in China, all the ports that it built and is building here in China. But it actually has overproduction of that ability now. So one of the ways to help China's economy keep growing, and what is known as win-win diplomacy, is to outsource some of that constructing ability elsewhere. So China donates money to Kenya. Here's $15 million. We're going to build you a school. And then China helps them decide to hire a Chinese company to come in and build the school, so that overproduction, that excess construction ability is now being utilized somewhere else.
The GDP of China and the GDP of Kenya both go up.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So China's like, we'll hire our own people to come in and build you a hospital. How does that sound?
Yeah, it works very, very well. I mean,
you get a free hospital, right?
There's a lot of people who criticize China for its high GDP is only based on infrastructure growth. Wait a moment, is that a criticism or is that a praise? I'm not sure, but I think that's pretty good. And there's only a point to which they can add more infrastructure to maintain this GDP growth. But what you're saying there is, yes, they can still maintain GDP growth by outsourcing or sourcing outwards, not outsourcing, but sourcing outwards the GDP growth of China through the BRI. That's where the BRI is helping China's GDP to grow, because a lot of what they're doing, hell of a lot of what they're doing, is actually in other countries, but it is contributing to China's GDP growth, which is real GDP growth. And that was another thing. You made an incredibly astute observation a day before the Financial Times last week. You were ahead of the ball.
I got that from Kantan, but I just kind of took his idea and elaborated on it.
I thought you scooped the Financial Times.
Well, I did beat them by a day, so I was wondering if they had stolen my idea, because it was almost exactly the same thing. But there's a lot of stuff in the U.S. economy that isn't real at all. So it's very bizarre that they count unrealized rents from people who buy their own homes. So if you buy your own home in the United States, then the person who now owns their own home, the hypothetical rent that they would have paid as a renter is counted as part of the GDP, which makes no sense at all. Like, it's absolutely bizarre. But
it is bizarre. How does that happen?
I know. I have no idea. So yeah, the U.S. real GDP is much lower than it appears in the figures that the United States releases. China also builds huge, massive infrastructure projects for especially poor nations. So one example that I found first, and this is a gigantic one, is this is not alone. This was built for this Mozambique. It is a $447 million airport. A full airport with tarmac and like everything. The parking lot, everything down to the parking lot, the lights, everything completely built. 400. That's a $500 million.
Was that for free?
As a gift? Yeah,
a gift.
A gift.
Why?
That's not that. A lot of the BRI projects are oftentimes loans for projects that big, but this is actually just a gift.
Why?
Now, the criticism people throw, one of the big ones is that this is to create favorable conditions for that country to continue to cooperate with China. This is so that people like China, Jason. Yeah, of course it is.
The CCP only do those things so they can retain popularity.
I mean,
yes,
they're right. Why is that? Again, like you mentioned before, why is that a criticism? I would much rather have, instead of like, let's all hang out and have a dinner together and that's diplomacy and we shake hands, you build me an airport, come to my country, build me an airport for free, and then let's shake hands and have a party about that. That's fantastic diplomacy, and we should be learning from that.
I'm going to express my ignorance here. Did Mozambique convert from recognizing Taiwan to recognizing China?
Is that possible? I didn't check.
I don't know. I don't know if that happened. I'd have to research that. I should have researched that before we started. But I didn't realize you've got it in the. I didn't realize that was a freebie because you didn't say for free in there.
All of these ones that I gave as example are free.
Okay, right.
The example. Okay. I mean, I have plenty of examples that I know, hundreds and hundreds of projects I could find for you that are loans. But these ones in this list, everything is here donated. They're grants. They're completely free.
I'm gonna do some research after we've finished, and we'll put it into the description whether Mozambique converted from recognizing, because that sometimes does happen. You want an airport, we'll build you an airport, but why would we build you an airport if you don't even recognize us? Oh, well, we'll recognize you. So the Solomon Islands are exactly that. They have converted from recognizing Taiwan. And there's a couple in South America who've done the same thing fairly recently as well, or Central America. And I think that's once people start to see that, they say, well, the Americans aren't helping us. Why should we listen to them? And because it's really America that's driving this. You continue recognizing Taiwan and we'll help you. Now they're watching. This is why they're so angry about it. I know you're American. This is why Americans are so angry about it, the administration, because they're seeing that China is going in there and doing what they haven't done.
Mhm.
And they haven't done it for a long time. But you Jeffrey Sachs made a very valid point. In the 1950s and 1960s, who would not have wanted to be an American? It was the golden years. And even me growing up in the UK in the 1960s, I used to admire the Americans incredibly. And then something went wrong. And I don't know when it went wrong, but it went wrong. And maybe Vietnam was the catalyst for that. I don't know. Maybe Kennedy's death. I think it was heading in the right direction, and then it diverted. But for many, many years, these countries that recognize Taiwan have been encouraged by the United States to keep Taiwan as a recognized country, which of course it isn't. And the United Nations doesn't recognize it as such, but every country is entitled to their own opinion. And now China is saying, well, look, if you do recognize us, then it's going to be to your benefit. They can't really benefit the Vatican very much, but there's the rest of the countries, and the Solomons was one, and I think Ecuador was another. There's a few countries that have recently converted from recognizing Taiwan to recognizing China, and the benefits for doing that have been enormous. Now that's where people say, they're only doing it because. Well, fair enough, but they're doing it.
Mhm.
Criticize
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
I mean, under President Hu, a lot of these projects were stadiums, sports
Mm,
stadiums.
yeah.
And now, but there were still hydropower projects and so forth going back decades. But a lot of them under Hu were stadiums. But
Mm,
under President Xi Jinping, they have kind of turned towards things that are really useful. So I don't think there is a single stadium that I can find, but there are a few, exhibition centers.
yeah.
There are airports, there are roads, and then you have the Belt and Road, and then those are multi-billion-dollar projects where they're building hydropower dams and all kinds of things all over the world in 152 member countries. I think Italy just left a week ago,
They did.
so it
Yes.
might be
Formally.
151.
Yeah,
So that's most of
it's
the
been
world.
coming for a while, but Italy were given the new prime minister of Italy went to a meeting with Biden in America and came back and said we're going to be leaving the Belt and Road. So got the instructions. You want to be in the G7, you can't be in the BRI. Simple.
Mm.
That's what it boils down to.
Well, I think you watch a lot of the same speeches that I watch
Yeah.
that go around. And, basically leaders in developing countries, they don't want to be told the IMF, you can't IB, you can't work with BRI. They want to make their own decisions. If they
Yeah.
want a loan from the World Bank or whatever, that's up to them. And if the World Bank wants to cooperate, AIIB can give that loan instead, that should be up to the leaders in Kenya and Namibia or wherever. They should be able to
Mm.
make the decisions, and they are doing so. So for me, a lot of the criticisms that come out about Chinese development finance in the underdeveloped world, which is now starting to finally develop, it's disrespectful to them because they're the ones initiating these decisions. They're the ones
Mm.
signing off on the decisions, who they want to do business with, what loans they want to take, what kind of projects they want to develop. And so for the United States to go into these countries and say, no, it's us or them, is really disrespectful to them, one, but also then saying that it's a debt trap or something is ludicrous because firstly, it's not. And
Mm.
secondarily, it was the decision of that nation that they wanted to build that airport or that seaport or whatever it is.
Yeah. What's most interesting about that is that China, Xi Jinping in particular, has, and he did so just 2 weeks ago in the USA in San Francisco. He has repeatedly said it's not a competition between us. You can share the merit. We don't mind if you work with Americans. We don't mind if you work with us. It can be shared. It's not an issue. And it's the Americans who are saying, well, you got to choose BRI or Build Back Better World, B3W.
which
Whatever
have
happened to
provided
that?
zero projects so far, by the way.
They
Zero
they
projects.
did. The White House put out a bulletin about this. It was about a year ago, and I read it. And I looked at this and I thought, I've heard of these. These are new initiatives under the Build Back B3W system. And I looked at this. I know what I'm going to do. There was 7 or 8 different projects mentioned, and I went to each and every one of them, and I looked at where they started, when they started, what they were, and every single one of them has just been renamed, rebadged B3W. And I wrote an article which
Oh,
got published by Pearls and Irritations in Australia. And that's something I'm rather pleased with. When I write an article like that, Pearls and Irritations pick it up and say, we're going to run with this. And it just showed G7's B3W infrastructure cannot match BRI's infrastructure because there's literally nothing, not a single thing has happened that wasn't already happening. So nothing changed after the huge announcement of B3W. Fizzled out. It was a firework that didn't go bang.
you know, I want to change. We don't have any time left, but I want to say,
No.
I guess we're both going to struggle to say a few more things. One thing I want to say that this, all of these projects are enabling is more global stability. Because in
Yes.
2008, when the US economy went down, it took the world with it, basically. But if the world is more diffused and there are more modern places, there's more trade between other countries and other currencies and all of this activity going on. If one particular country goes down, the world may dip a little bit, but there's still
Mhm.
so much else going on that it's not going to take the entire world down again. So
Well, we're
this
watching in
is in
real
the US
time.
best interest if the
Yeah,
US wants to recover after one of these
we're
busts.
watching in real time as Korea, Japan, United Kingdom, all and Germany all suffer from declining GDPs. Now, that's really serious stuff. These are major economies. These are top 10 economies in the world, all starting to come. I think South Korea is a little lower than that, but Japan, UK, Germany, these are in the top 10. They're in the
Mhm,
G7.
mhm.
These economies are all struggling. The US, as you very succinctly pointed out, is living on vapors. It's not really a real true GDP because if you take out what doesn't exist, it's a collapsing GDP. Now, their only reason for continuing is because of the use of the dollar, and even that is declining. So you are in a position now where any one of those countries collapsing would cause a devastating effect. I think that BRI is probably 10 years too late. Had it started 10 years before and was in further development right now, we might be in a much safer, more stable position. But the point you make about stability is very well made, but no one can afford, and China doesn't want the United States to collapse. The United States would be quite
Right.
happy
Yeah.
if China collapses, but the rest of the world would not. Australia, for example, I mean, I'm an Australian citizen, and it would be devastating to Australia's economy if China collapses. It would absolutely destroy Australia. Something close to 40% of all their imports and exports are here in China. So you've got that kind of situation. Nobody wants any country to collapse. It's bad for the world. And the stability that we need is slowly creeping up with the developing world developing their own GDPs. The GDP of the world is going up, and China is driving that.
Well, just to really mention something at the end is that I think the United States, the leaders there, who seem to me as an American clueless a little bit about China, they went from we want to decouple
Yeah.
to we want to
De-risk.
we want to de-risk to
Yeah.
now they're not even saying that anymore.
No,
Now they're
they
just
can't.
like, oh, we want to try to do this little thing or that little thing, but there's no overarching mechanism for like trying to damage Sino-US relations because they've
Mm,
come to the realization that you and I had years ago that that's not in anyone's interest. It's not in US
it's not.
interests. Anyways, we're so out of time. Do you have any last thoughts by Jerry Gray?
Last thoughts by Jerry Gray is the green light. Did you see the green light speech? What the European Union is doing at the moment is they're
No.
sending a signal of stop, go, and slow to China. We just need this finalized. Do you want us to be your partner? Do you want us to be your rival? Do you want us to be your enemy? You've got to make that decision, and that's the rest of the world needs to do that. China is not the enemy.
Hmm.
People telling you the enemy is China, they are your enemy. That's my final word.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you for
Thank
joining
you
me.
so much, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.